So, Chapter 15 looks at how forensic psychology can be applied to children and families. And before you get into this lecture, I just want to give you a content warning that there is some material in here about child sexual assault. This can be particularly difficult material to hear, so if you need to stop and take a break, please do so. Also, on Blackboard is the number for the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center for their hotline should you need support. So there's 2.6 million reports of possible child maltreatment every year, but only 26% of the cases of seriously injured and moderately injured children are fully investigated by Child Protective Service agencies. Now, first we're going to talk about these two broad types of child maltreatment: neglect and abuse. So neglect is basically the failure to provide for a child's basic needs, and as opposed to being a willful positive act, it's an act of omission. It also includes failure to provide supervision, food, shelter, medical, or dental care. It can also include failure to educate a child or attend to special educational or emotional needs. And the rate of child neglect in the United States is 7.2 per 1,000 children in the U.S. Now, parents who neglect their children are more likely than abusive parents to have difficulties with anger control, low self-esteem, and psychopathology. And risk factors include violence in the marriage, a lack of social support, parental alcohol abuse, unemployment, and a maternal history of child abuse. Now, victims may internalize or externalize their problems. Internalizing problems looks like apathy and withdrawal and low self-esteem, while externalizing that looks like conduct disorders and verbal and physical aggression. And neglect can lead to language delays of 6 to 9 months and greater difficulty in verbal comprehension, articulation, and cognitive development. We also see in children that have been neglected greater cognitive and academic deficits, lower scores on standardized math, language, and reading tests. And they rank low in peer acceptance and overall emotional health by their teachers. Now, child abuse includes several types of abuse: physical, emotional, and sexual child abuse. Physical abuse is anything that can cause injury, and this is about 19% of child maltreatment victims. Emotional child abuse is anything that impairs the emotional development or sense of self-esteem or worth, and that's about 8% of cases. And child sexual abuse includes molestation, rape, voyeurism, exhibitionism, pornography, and forced prostitution. And about 80% of child sexual abusers are parents. Now, parent-child incest is the type that's most commonly reported, but in actuality, sibling incest is probably the most common form. Approximately 1 in 12 children between the ages of 2 and 17 report being sexually abused, and about 20% of adult women and 10% of adult men report being sexually abused. Women are more likely to be abused by relatives, and their perpetrators are usually male. Now, what are some indicators of child sexual abuse? Does the child have an unusual degree of sexual knowledge or sexual behavior for their age? Things like early first sexual intercourse, having older partners, experience with numerous, that should say partners, not parents, more frequent intercourse, and exchanging sex for money. Now, the ways this can impact someone is everything from depression to anxiety to PTSD to eating problems and sleeping problems. On the other hand, approximately 20 to 30% of sexually abused children show no emotional symptoms, but many victims do encounter problems in their adult relationships and adult sexual functioning. Now, pedophilia crosses the boundaries between physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and it is actually a disorder. Pedophilia is a paraphilia, and it is in the DSM, and it's a disorder of sexual desire involving considerable fantasy and behavior upon which sexual gratification depends. Pedophilia is not the same thing as actually abusing a child. So there are people who sexually offend against children who aren't pedophiles, and there are pedophiles who don't sexually offend. But it does often lead to criminal activity. Now, in the DSM, it's a condition in which a person's ability for sexual arousal and gratification is based upon fantasizing about and engaging in sexual behavior that is atypical and usually extreme. Now, we're talking about paraphilias here. And they can center on objects or around behavior. They're more common in men. And the key here is that this is what your sexual gratification depends on. It depends on that object or that act. Now, paraphilias include pedophilia, exhibitionism, voyeurism, frotteurism, fetishism, sexual masochism and sadism, transvestic fetish, asphyxiophilia, coprophilia, urophilia, and zoophilia. Now, pedophiles usually first gain the trust or even friendship of their intended victims, and they may often seek out jobs or volunteer opportunities that allow them close contact with children. Now, when direct sexual contact occurs with a child, it's generally fellatio or cunnilingus, although some prefer to fondle or touch their victims. When they do engage in actual intercourse, the victim is generally a little bit older. Now, most pedophiles prefer female victims, and with female victims, the offender is more likely to be a relative, and the offense is more likely to occur in the victim's residence. With male victims, though, we're much more likely to see stranger offenses that occur outside the residence. Now, one thing to just clarify is pedophilia is a sexual attraction to prepubescent children. Pubescent children, once children have started to develop secondary sex characteristics and go through puberty, that sexual preference is called hebephilia, and it is not actually listed in the DSM as a diagnosis. So, how do we assess whether or not someone might be a pedophile? Well, we can do this through clinical interviews where we ask questions about sexual thoughts and behavior. And usually here what we would see is someone who acknowledges having frequent and intense fantasies about having sex with children, someone who collects and masturbates to media depicting children, and engages in repeated sexual acts involving children. One thing you'd want to do while interviewing someone who you suspect may be a pedophile is to get them to explain their social contacts with children. So men who have limited social and sexual contacts with adults, but a high emotional and social affinity for children are more likely to be pedophiles. Now, also the number of adults with whom a man has had sexual contact is inversely related to the amount of sexual arousal he exhibits to stimuli depicting children. Pedophiles have fewer meaningful or even purely sexual contacts with adults. Now, many self-identified pedophiles have never been married, and those that have report poor sexual relationships with their spouses. Now, one issue with getting information via interviews is that sometimes people will lie. We can also use several self-report questionnaires, and these are a variety of clinical tools that have a variety of questions and a variety of scales that are designed to assess sexual deviancy. So you could use the multiphasic sex inventory, which is assessing sexual behavior and thoughts dealing with sexual deviance, atypical sexual behavior, sexual dysfunction, and general knowledge and attitudes about sex and attraction. And this has had some success in differentiating between sex offenders and non-sex offenders. The Clark Sexual History Questionnaire has correctly classified in some studies 45% up to as many as 90% of their subjects. And the Wilson Sexual Fantasy Questionnaire has themes of sex with a consenting partner, sex with multiple partners, sex with strangers, and fantasies about children under the age of 12. Now, there's also a variety of tools that we see used more in the criminal justice system, like the Static 99. One thing to keep in mind is that we don't have any research or studies on how well any of these tools actually predict offending or recidivism. Now, another way we might be able to investigate whether or not someone has sexual attraction to children is using neuroimaging. So these are techniques, usually an fMRI, that allows us to measure mental activity and brain patterns. Now, the fMRI has been used to detect differences in both the anterior cingulate gyrus and the right orbitofrontal cortex. So one thing that they found was that there was different activities when pedophiles were shown boys in swimsuits. This suggests to us that the same areas of the brain involved in processing sexual stimuli by pedophiles and non-pedophiles are the same. Now, hopefully neuroimaging can eventually advance to the point where we would be able to see the brain structures that are involved in processing sexual stimuli, therefore allowing clinicians to really be able to predict or look at reoffending. Now, there's also this thing called child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, and this is attempting to outline why child sexual abuse victims of intrafamilial abuse may be reluctant to disclose. And these pieces shouldn't be all that surprising. So generally, the child may have been threatened with physical harm or the breakup of their family if they didn't keep this secret. The child may feel helpless if they're dependent on the abuser and may feel trapped by their circumstances. They might also feel conflicted over what's the right thing to do, and perhaps they've already had some delayed or unconvincing disclosures. Now, testimony about this in court by expert witnesses can be used to explain seemingly inconsistent behavior. Why does someone delay in reporting? Why are there a lack of witnesses or physical evidence? And why has a victim maybe later on retracted their disclosure? But this can be pretty confusing to jurors because we can see these same behaviors in children who have not been abused. So courts haven't really been very good about scrutinizing the scientific basis of this syndrome. So courts should consider things like error rates, peer-reviewed publications, and general acceptance by the relevant scientific community. Now, what about online sexual predators? One thing to keep in mind as we talk about this pretty scary issue is that most teens, anyway, are actually pretty sophisticated in their use of the internet. But about 40% of children say they trust people they meet on the web, and yet 1 in 5 has received a solicitation for sex. So some sexual online predators basically groom children by giving them attention and showing affection and kindness. They might be particularly aware of the latest music and hobbies, and then that sexual content is slowly introduced. Now, some jump right into sexually explicit conversation with children. Others are seeking face-to-face meetings, but most are patient enough to use and exploit the needs of their victims in order to develop relationships with them. And it is important to note that while there are offenders that pretend to be children or people of the same age, that many victims are actually aware that the predator, the person they're speaking to, is an adult. Now, switching focus here, infanticide is the deliberate killing of a newborn. And about 2,000 years ago in Europe, and for a period after that, this wasn't even a crime. Fathers had the right to decide whether or not to raise a child or to allow it to die. And reasons for this include a lack of economic resources. Basically, each additional child was actually a burden on a family, and a desire to eliminate illegitimate children. Now, in 1623, they passed the Act to prevent the destroying and murdering of bastard children. And this basically provides a punishment of death to any unmarried woman who conceals the death of her bastard child. And the burden was on her to prove she had intended to care for the child that it was stillborn. And she actually needed to produce a witness that the child was stillborn. Now, by the end of the 17th century, you could defend yourself on the basis of temporary insanity. In 1803, the burden of proving that it was a live birth switched to the prosecution, and by 1828, this law applied to all women. Now, neonaticide refers to killing a newborn within the first 24 hours, whereas filicide is the killing of any child that's older than 24 hours. Now, active neonaticide is killing as a direct result of violence, while passive neonaticide is allowing the child to maybe fall in a toilet and then not take any action to prevent it from drowning. Now, anywhere from about 1,200 to 1,500 young children are killed each year by a parent or other person. And we do see some common traits of mothers who commit filicide. There's generally a coolness and detachment during childhood from their own mothers, suicidal thoughts or attempts, substantial feelings of personal inadequacy, mental illness, and feelings that their child was somehow defective. Now, there can be filicide for a variety of reasons. Could be associated with suicide. So a mother desires to commit suicide but doesn't want to abandon the child. It could be to relieve suffering. This could be real or imagined suffering. It could be misguided altruism, where the parent believes the killing is actually in the best interest of the child. And then we might also have acutely psychotic filicide, where someone is having psychosis, active hallucinations, and delusions, and the filicide actually seems rational to them. These mothers are usually in their late 20s or early 30s and married, and often may have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar, or another severe personality disorder. Now, postpartum depression affects 10 to 22% of adult women, but postpartum psychotic depression may also be present, and these are command hallucinations to kill the infant or delusions that the infant is possessed. This occurs in about 1 to 500 or 1 to 1,000 deliveries. And it's definitely increased for mothers who have had a prior postpartum depression. And we talked prior about the Andrea Yates case, and this is a great example of this. You can brush up on this by reading the relevant portion of the chapter. Now, unwanted child filicide is where the child is seen as a burden, preventing one or both parents from reaching their goals in life. Now, in 1895, we have a case of filicide in People v. Campbell, where the father and mother were indicted for killing their newborn child. But only the father was tried and sentenced, and he was solely convicted on the testimony of the mother. There was no body or no remains ever discovered. And so this case was eventually reversed because a baby's death cannot be established by circumstantial evidence alone. Now, for a charge of murder of a newborn child, we have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the baby was born alive and had independent circulation. Now, we also have what's called the Safe Haven Act. And this is a legal and safe way for mothers to relinquish newborn babies. So this is that situation where you can say you've had a baby and you don't know what to do and you don't believe you can take care of this baby, where you can relinquish them at a fire department or a police department. Now, Massachusetts used to have this crazy ad that I'm going to play for you about the baby safe haven law.
If you have a baby and don't know what to do,
Baby Safe Haven
can help you choose. When the baby's born and you're feeling all alone,
and the mother's confused because she can't provide a home.
though I can but can't be there, another option is adoption. But where can I go for help?
Bring the baby to the cops or a hospital.
It's possible.
No strings attached, no questions asked. If you have a baby and don't know what to do, Baby Safe Haven can help you choose. Baby Safe Haven. Baby Safe Haven.
Now enjoy having Baby Safe Haven stuck in your head all night. Now, the Abandoned Infant Protection Act does create an affirmative defense for prosecution for abandonment of a child. Oh,
But you know it's true. Good evening, everybody.
sorry guys, I'm trying to figure out how to get out of the slideshow and shut off YouTube.
And perhaps the last white
Okay, there we go. Apologies. This creates an affirmative defense for prosecution for abandonment of a child, so long as you can show that you intended the child to be safe from physical injury, that you left the child with an appropriate person or in a suitable location, and you promptly notified an appropriate person of that child's location. So that's basically the Safe Haven Act. Now, there's also parental alienation syndrome, and this is where there's intense rejection of a parent by children after divorce. And it can also include the exaggerated criticism by one parent of the other parent that's expressed to the children. Now, what about filicide that is motivated by religion? Your chapter talks about several cases where a parent, in one case, severed her daughter's arms, in another case, bashed in the head of their 6 and 8-year-olds, and in another case, slit the throat of an 8-year-old, all in response to some type of Bible verse or divine signs. Now, we also have honor killings, which we talked about very briefly in the beginning of this year. 16-year-old Aksa Parvez was killed in an honor killing, and an honor killing is an act of murder in which a woman is killed for her actual or perceived immoral behavior. And it's often done to women who do not accept their family's tribal or Islamic traditions. And they refuse forced marriages and marry according to their will or live independently. And basically, they're killed to save the honor of the family. And in this case, Parvez was killed by her father because she refused to wear the hijab. Now, 16-year-old Palestina Issa was killed by her father. Now, this murder was accidentally audio recorded by the FBI because her father was under surveillance as a terrorist. And so they have an audio recording of the entire murder, where he stabs his daughter 13 times as his wife holds her down, and he's repeatedly yelling at her to die quickly. Now, honor killers often expect to receive life sentences because, their religious beliefs from outside the U.S. basically encourage or allow this. Now, gendercide is when family members kill female babies and young girls. And this is a practice that has decreased, in the mid-1900s in China, but we've seen it reinstitutionalized due to the old policy in China that was introduced in 1979, which was the one-child policy. So since males were more prized in China, If and a person was only allowed to have one baby, if you had a female baby, many people might have killed that child. Now, we also have elder abuse and neglect, and this is knowing, intentional, or negligent acts by a caregiver or any other person that causes harm or a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable adult. And there's between 1 and 2 million Americans age 65 or older who are injured, exploited, or otherwise mistreated every year, but only about 1 in 14 incidents come to the attention of the police. Now, elders are likely not to disclose because they fear abandonment, being institutionalized, or severe repercussions from their abuser. Now, we see this more often in households where there's discord because of the elder's presence. So, an elderly family member has been taken into the home. If there's a history of violent interaction, poor stress tolerance. If the family's isolated, lacks caregiving skills, are financially burdened, abuse alcohol, and are depressed or were dependent on the victim. Now, there are some victim characteristics that also increase the likelihood of abuse. If the victim is in poor health, has Alzheimer's, depression, or cognitive impairment. Now, this also includes physical and emotional abuse, which we discussed prior, and neglect. It also includes sexual abuse and financial exploitation. So that financial exploitation could be happening directly by your caregivers, but it would also include scams that are perpetrated against the elderly. And then finally, healthcare fraud and abuse, where we charge for care that was not provided, over-medicate, or double bill for services. Now, ageism is any attitude, action, or institutional structure which subordinates a person or group because of their age. Now, intervention strategies to keep in mind for elder abuse include making sure we have residential shelters for victims, teaching the community how to detect and prevent elder abuse, doing the same thing for law enforcement and other community professionals. Combinations of different types of therapy that focus on behavioral skills training, cognitive restructuring, and emotional control. And then, of course, building social support networks, both for caregivers and for the elders. And that wraps up our chapter.